Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books out loud while stoned. In this video, we're going to start part 2 of Little Blue Book number 1128, titled The Church and the School, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1928. So when you hear him speak of modern times, the modern age, it is 1928 he's speaking of, not our modern age. Okay, here we go. Chapter 3. Education in the Roman Empire. In one of his essays, Sir Leslie Stephen says that he finds a certain Roman described as teaching a young emperor notatio. And he remarks that since notation is meaningless, it must be an error for notatio, swimming. My friend Sir Leslie was greatly surprised when I told him that notation means shorthand, and that it was well known in ancient Rome. Even so cultivated a person as Sir Leslie Stephen may be excused for not knowing that the ancient Romans were familiar with shorthand. But it is difficult to find excuses for those who, in writing about Christianity and education, portray a complete ignorance of the Roman school system. A large part of every history of education is devoted to it, and there is no modern work on the Roman Empire which fails to describe it. We have the decrees of the pagan emperors successively enlarging and endowing the system. We have in the lives of men like St. Augustine, a complete account of the ladder of education up which even a poor Roman youth might climb. And in the city of Pompeii, from which we have removed the shroud of volcanic ash, which smothered it nearly 19 centuries ago, we have striking evidence, including election posters on the walls, of the general literacy of the population. When it is said that Christianity succeeded paganism, and was far superior to it, we have specifically to understand that by paganism is meant the Roman Empire, and this general ignorance of the true features of the Roman Empire is part of a deliberate clerical error or clerical policy. The Greeks frankly recognized their debt to earlier civilizations, and the Romans were not less grateful to the Greeks. But the new religion which came to dominate Europe had no human sentiments, and in its own interest it libeled and scoffed at its predecessors. Modern scholarship fully restores the credit of the ancient empire, and teaches us that it was precisely one of the glories of Rome that it gave the world the first complete system of general education. By the second half of the 14th century, the period when Christianity took over the rule of the world, there was in the Roman Empire a general system of elementary schools for the children of the workers. The children of the wealthy were, of course, educated at home, generally by freedmen, but all the evidence goes to show that the children of the workers quite generally were, at the expense of the municipality, taught to read and write and cipher. We have no statistics. How many schools there were even in Rome, how far there were schools in rural districts, what proportion of the population could read and write, are questions that we cannot answer. But we have ample evidence that a network of primary schools spread over the empire. Well, I wonder if we found any evidence since then on the amount of schools and stuff. That'd be interesting information. St. Augustine, for instance, was born in 354 AD in the very small Roman town of Thogast, in what is now Algeria. He, as a matter of course, found and attended a free elementary school in his native town to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. When he had mastered these elementary accomplishments, he passed to the grammar, or high school, in the same small Africo-Roman town. His parents intended him for the bar, and he was, at the age of 16, sent to the still higher school, the school of rhetoric. Even for this, he did not need to go to Carthage. After a few further years, he was sent to the great school at Carthage, which might be likened to the modern university. It is quite clear from Augustine's own words that for this education, as such, nothing was paid, and he had the decrees of the emperors fixing the salaries which the municipality had to pay teachers. From this one experience, therefore, we may realize the general condition of the civilized parts of the Roman Empire. Small towns like Thogast had a free grammar school as well as free elementary schools. Literacy must have been the general condition, and in fact ancient Pompeii, with its names cut in marble slabs at every street's corner, shows that the people were generally literate. The elementary school was so poor that we have no difficulty in believing that there was one wherever there were a few score children to each. Quite commonly it was held in the porch of a house, with sheets of canvas at each end, and the teacher received a miserable payment. He usually had some other means of livelihood in addition, yet he was proverbially a poor man. Cabbage cooked a second time kills wretched schoolmasters, says a famous line of Horace. Such schools could be multiplied all over the empire, and the imperial decrees give us an assurance that they were. We may, therefore, assume that the great majority of the free citizens of the empire could read and write. In those paperless days, writing would not be a matter of much consequence, but it was taught in the elementary school. Tablets coated with wax were used as one wrote with a stylus, pointed at one end for writing, and broad and flat at the other end for erasing. Simple arithmetic also was taught, and literary men of the time have left us their grumbles at the noise made by the children as they sang their twice, two, or four. Twice, two, or four. There the education of the bulk of the Roman ends. And we will not for a moment pretend that this education was of much social or moral importance. Most of them probably never read anything but racing cards for the next chariot race. All books were written by hand, and were very costly, so that we must not imagine many of the workers, even of the ancient Rome, reading Horace or Virgil. My only point here is that when Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire, it was covered by a network of elementary schools, and the people were generally literate. 200 years later, there was hardly a school in Europe, and apart from the clergy, not one man in 1,000 could read. If the little town of Thogast had its secondary or grammar schools, we may assume that the empire was very liberally provided with what we should now call high schools. The teacher in these had a higher salary, and the education again was free. There were large numbers of private schools in addition, and many masters of such schools became wealthy. All teachers were exempted from the heavy municipal burdens which fell upon the middle class generally in the Roman Empire. And above the rank of the elementary teacher, all were respected members of the community. Boys attended these schools of the grammarian from about 12 to 16, and these there were copies handwritten on parchment of all the classic writers of Rome, and the master taught from them not only literature as such, but the elements of all knowledge that the Greeks had bequeathed to the Romans: history, mythology, geography, natural history, physics, mathematics, and philosophy. Most of the pupils knew shorthand, and the master's comments would be easily taken down on tablets. For no pupil would have such a thing as private lesson books. Greek also was taught, and the boy made his first acquaintance with Greek literature. In the complete absence of statistics, we are quite unable to say what proportion of the boys of the empire passed on to the grammar school, nor can we in the least determine what amount of education was given to girls. If a town of a few thousand people like Thogast, in the heart of Numidia, had such a school, we may justly infer that they were very numerous. Much less numerous, for the teacher was very well paid, were schools of the next grade. The schools of rhetoric, to which a boy was sent about the age of 16. The teacher of rhetoric, or oratory, was assigned by the imperial government a salary twice as high as that of the grammarian, and he was quite an important person in the community. The common conception of the Romans as a handful of patricians, mostly idle sensualists, and a population of slaves is almost as untrue as it would be if it were applied to modern America. The schools of oratory alone, if one were to collect all the facts which we have about them, would show how absurd such a conception is. Private teachers of rhetoric made fortunes at one time in Rome, and in the 4th century there was a kind of university of rhetoricians. Rhetoricians. With 30 masters on the Capitol Hill. Fine speaking and the art of letter writing were as much esteemed by the middle-class Romans as they have ever been in any age, and crowds of youths frequented the schools of oratory everywhere. Good rhetoricians, lecturers as we should now say, traveled over the empire and found enthusiastic audiences. St. Augustine himself was a municipally paid teacher of rhetoric in the public school at Milan at the time of his conversion to Christianity, and in his Confessions he tells us of the crowds of pupils he found in the schools as he climbed the Roman ladder of education. In the rhetorical school, the miscellaneous education, history, geography, science, mathematics, etc., of the grammar school was continued, and music and logic, on the basis of Aristotle's work, were studied. As far as knowledge existed in those days, a Roman youth of 18 must have been quite an accomplished person in the 4th century. Hydrate, kids. It is clear, since the higher teachers were amply paid by the municipality, which must also have provided the buildings that children of the workers could pass beyond the elementary school, and it is even clearer that poor youths of exceptional promise could and did pass on to the highest schools of the empire, which we may more or less compare to our modern universities. One such school, the great imperial school of rhetoric on the Capitol at Rome, I have already described. A youth might be sent up to this by the magistrate of his province, from any part of the empire, and he was then supported and taught without payment, and his conduct was strictly watched. Another was the great school at Carthage, where Augustine completed his education. Constantinople, Milan, and other large cities of the empire had similar schools. Some were specialized schools of law, others of engineering or architecture. In an empire which was famous for its administration of law and for its remarkable enterprise in building beautiful towns, aqueducts, bridges, amphitheaters, etc., in every part of the known world, a very large middle class was bound to arise, and a moment's reflection should suffice to convince any person that, even if we had no positive traces of their existence, vast numbers of the good schools must have been provided for their training in every part of the empire. And, apart from these large bodies of professional men, there was still larger body of leisured middle-class men of moderate fortune, who discharged the municipal functions of their towns. Most of these men had a high ideal of culture. It is hardly too much to say that, having due regard to the narrow limitations of positive knowledge at the time, the last generation of these pagan Romans at the time when the emperors were forcing Christianity upon Europe, see Little Blue Book number 1110, were more cultivated, as we say now, than the corresponding class in a modern civilization. They are vividly portrayed for us both in the letters of Symmachus, then prefect of Rome and a great orator, and in the Saturnilla, a volume of imaginary conversations of Macrobius, and in the latter book, especially, the cruelty and sensuality which most people associate with a Roman patrician, and especially described as things of the remote past. The church, in short, came to power in a world where the middle class were gentlemen, and the great mass of the workers had at least learned to read and write. In the year 400, when the triumph of Christianity was complete, the leaders of the church found a complete government system of schools radiating from Rome over the entire empire. Paganism had created those schools. What was the attitude of the church toward them? That's the end of chapter 3. Let's see. We'll go on to chapter 4. Chapter 4, of course, what the church did. Hydrate. Let us try, as usual, to detect and recognize any truth that there may be in the Christian claim. When that claim is formulated, as it usually is, in the bald statement that Christianity founded education in Europe, or gave the world schools, any open-minded Christian will now recognize that he was deceived by it. He probably understands it to mean that there were no schools, or any schools for the children of the wealthy, until the new religion began to educate. Nothing could be further from the truth. Any encyclopedia of education or manual of the history of education will give you the facts, which I have summarized in the last chapter. Pagan Rome had a magnificent and general and free system of schools, and your authority will further assure you that in the course of the 5th century, this Roman system of schools was entirely destroyed. By the year 400, as I said, Christianity had become, by imperial decree, the sole religion of the empire, which means of the entire civilized world, apart from India and China. By the year 500, there was not a single trace left of the pagan structure of schools. No writer on education can prove the existence of a single school in Europe at this date. To say, therefore, that Christianity gave the world schools, when its triumph was followed by the annihilation of the finest system of education the world ever had until the second half of the 19th century, is a constructive untruth of a monumental character. For there is not the least controversy anywhere about these two facts, that the pagan Romans of the 4th century had a fine system of general and higher education, and that the whole of it perished in the 5th century. All that could honestly be claimed by any man who has troubled to read history of education, any manual of it, is that Christianity did not destroy the Roman school system, and that if schools arose in Europe at a later date, as they obviously did, Christianity gave the world these schools. That, let me repeat, is not the impression with which the Christian apologist gives his readers. And I may add, from clerical experience, that it is not the meaning of the religious writers themselves. Although I was for several years a professor and ultimately head of a college in the Church of Rome, I then knew nothing whatever about these facts. We merely copied from earlier apologists and repeated the traditional claim that Christianity gave the world education. These traditional claims we never dreamed of checking by modern authorities. The preacher who repeats them today is usually honest. They are given to him as part of his clerical education. They occur still as brazenly as ever in his apologetic literature. There is not one preacher in 1,000 who goes further and inquires if the facts, as given in modern history, support the claims he makes. However, let us now see what truth there may be in this new and more modest claim. that Christianity was powerless to prevent the destruction of the Roman schools, and that when they had all disappeared, it did give the world new schools. And in order that the reader may feel confident that I am not tempted to give him a one-sided version of the facts, I will follow the lead of the latest authoritative manual of the history of education, D. W. Boyd's History of Western Education, written in 1901. If it differs at all from the works previously published by experts on the subject, it differs mainly in its attempt to avert criticism from the Church. It is anything but anti-clerical. Mr. Boyd describes the Roman school system of which I have given an account. This situation is clear, he says, but the fate of the schools when Christianity triumphed is more obscure. We shall see that the only obscurity is as to the precise manner in which the murder was committed, Mr. Boyd says of the Roman schools. All that can be said with certainty about them is that they were flourishing in the 4th century, though even then signs of decline were evident, and that, with a few exceptions, they had disappeared by the 6th century. He does not give us the signs of decline in the 4th century beyond pointing out that the young Emperor Gratian, at the time under pagan influence, in the year 376, renewed the law that the municipalities must pay teachers and increased their salaries. We may, however, well believe that, as the empire was steadily decaying economically and the movements of the barbarians had begun, provincial schools began to suffer about that time. We are then told that, with a few exceptions, these Roman schools disappeared in the course of the 5th century, or within 100 years of the triumph of Christianity. That statement, coming from an expert who is friendly to the Church, must seem disconcerting enough to the man who has believed all his life that his religion gave the world education. Yet it is a little short of the truth. Mr. Boyd had no right to say, with few exceptions. He cannot trace any schools in Europe in the year 500. He says that the course of events is less obscure in Gaul than any other part of the empire. What does he find in Gaul? First, that in the days of Asonius, 309 to 394, or pagan times, Roman education was flourishing amongst the upper classes of Gaul and enjoying the imperial favor as in the best days of the empire. No signs of the decline you notice. Next, he finds that in the days of Sidonius Apollonius, Apollinarius, Sidonius Apollinarius, 430 to 484, Christian times. It is doubtful whether even in 430, the date of his birth, the schools of higher learning were any longer in existence. He says nothing whatever about the schools of lower learning, and he fails to give us proof of the existence of any public school at all in the 6th century. But we will return later to this point. Let us first see how the schools were destroyed. Here again, there is no controversy. The Roman schools were destroyed because the Roman Empire was destroyed. From the north of Europe, such hordes of Goths and Vandals poured over every part of the Western Empire that they completely wrecked it. Rome was sacked. The empire was abolished. The provinces were beggared. The municipal administration was broken up. The estates and property of the wealthy class, which, in the Roman fiscal system, bore all the burden of the municipal offices, were ruined. How in such circumstances could the educational system survive? Then, my Christian reader will exclaim, we simply have to restate the claim on behalf of the Church. We now fully admit that paganism gave the world education, just as it gave the world benevolent institutions, and improved the lot of the slave and of women. These things were all destroyed by forces of which the Church was not in the least responsible, and when they were restored by Christianity. We need not be punctilious. And that's what punctilious. If a Christian finds any consolation in the fact that his church gave Europe in the course of time a very slender and paltry amount of what the pagans had previously given it in lavish abundance, it is not ours to quarrel. What I am mainly concerned with is the claim that Christianity rendered services which paganism had not rendered. That is the almost universal claim, but even this new and very modest claim has to be examined. What was the attitude of Christianity, of the Christian bishops and writers, toward learning and education? That, surely, is a point of great importance. You see, we have two historical facts to explain. First, the destruction of the Roman schools. Secondly, the fact that at least 90, and for many centuries 95% of Europe remained illiterate for the next 1400 years. Mr. Boyd rightly says that the barbarians, not the church, destroyed the schools. But, being a responsible expert, he has to add, the ambiguous position of schools of pagan learning in a professedly Christian community had made a large section of the people distrustful of them, and little disposed to do anything to avert their ruin. In other words, we see the truth of my second proposition, that Christianity contemplated without a murmur, or even with approval, the destruction of the Roman schools. A large section of the people disliked the schools, Mr. Boyd says. One must regret that even academic experts think it necessary to wrap historical facts in this kind of language, so as to conciliate believers. It was the priests, the bishops, who opposed the Roman schools. We have no indication of what the people thought about them. We have plenty of evidence as to what the bishops thought. No doubt the more fanatical Christians, who echoed faithfully whatever the clergy said, did oppose the schools. The murder of Hypatia, although it was imputed to a different motive, might be quoted as an illustration. But as I say in another little blue book, number 1110, the overwhelming mass of the pagans were not converted to Christianity. They were simply forced to attend its services and were very far from fanaticism. Hydrate. Let us be quite frank about the facts. The Christian leaders or bishops hated the schools, and their hatred was quite natural. A historian has picturesquely said that when the Roman gods and goddesses were ejected from the temples, they found a refuge in the schools. The whole literature used in the schools was saturated with pagan mythology, and much of it was contrary to the Christian code of morals. But the alternative is obvious. If the church had any zeal for education, why not set up schools of its own? Schools and teachers were very cheap in those days, and in the second half of the 4th century, the church had ample funds. St. John Chrysostom boasts of having 100,000 Christians in Antioch, and there were in his time plenty of rich Christians for conversion, opened the door to court favor. Ambrose had a great following in Milan, and the Christian emperor resided there. The papacy was rich from at least about 380 onward, in the latter part of the 4th century. In fact, the bishops could get whatever they wanted from the emperors, and they did get large sums of money. The truth is that the Christian leaders did not care 2 cents about education, and in the 4th century, when it was possible for the church to do something, most of them were hostile to it. Mr. Boyd makes every effort to find traces of some concern for education in the early church or in the writings of the fathers. He finds only a few catechetical schools, especially at Alexandria in the time of Clement. The very name tells us that the purpose of these schools was religion, not education, and they were set up at the time when the Christians were in a small minority and were taunted by the pagans with their ignorance. One of the most common tricks and most misleading practices of apologists is to pay no attention to dates. Scientists who opposed evolution 20 or even 40 years ago are quoted as if they were men of our time, and the reader generally assumes that they are. Defects of Roman life, which were removed by the Stoics 200 or 300 years before the Church, had any power, are quoted as if they still existed when Christianity was made the state religion. In this matter of education, the custom is to quote Clement of Alexandria and his school, and to suppress the fact that he lived at the end of the 2nd and beginning of the 3rd century. It was, as I said, in the second half of the 4th century that the Church had the resources to build schools and the political power to remodel the school system. By that time, moreover, there was an abundant Christian literature, including 1 or 2 poets, to use as textbooks instead of Livy and Ovid and Virgil. But nothing was done. Not one of the Christian leaders appreciated the moral value of education as such. It was superfluous. It was a waste of time. It was demoralizing. Some years ago, a French priest, the Abbé Guam, started a crusade against classical education in France. He appealed for a return to the early Christian attitude toward it, and in his book, The Gnawing Worm of Modern Society, he naively gives us this early attitude. Education was a robbery of God. Tertullian said, after Jesus Christ, all curiosity, after the gospel, all inquiry are superfluous. He says in another place, Lactantius himself, one of the best Christian scholars of the 4th century and a layman, tutor to the emperor's son, moreover ridiculed all zeal for knowledge. How much happier should I be, he asked scornfully, if I knew where the Nile rises or what the physicists think about the heavens. Most learned and most influential of all were Jerome and Augustine, the 2 saints who dominated Christian thought precisely at the time when the church got wealth and power. Compare, in his history of pedagogy, Peadagogy, pedagogy, represents Jerome as favoring culture because he describes himself as a Cicerone. The reader gets the impression that Jerome was proud of his fine style and knowledge of letters. It was just the contrary. It is in one of his letters that Jerome uses the phrase. He tells his correspondent that he has had a dream in which he stood before the judgment seat, and when he proclaimed himself a Christian, Christ sternly replied, "Thou liest, thou art a Cicerone, and not a Christian. For where thy treasure is, there also is thy heart." By such methods of apology, one could easily prove that Byron was a devout follower of Darwin and Mr. Riley of Epicurean. Okay. Someone find out what Cicerone is. Ciceronian. Put it in the comments. Love to know that. Okay. Hydrate, kids. Another of the learned writers on education, Dr. Capps, represents St. Augustine as an advocate of learning and education by quoting his earlier works. Augustine had not yet been baptized, even when he wrote some of them. It is in his later and really influential works that you will find his effective attitude. He proudly calls Plato a fool. He now thinks that it is the ignorant who attain heaven. I have fully described his degeneration in my St. Augustine and his age. He had not the least interest in the schools. On the whole, he thought that the end of the world predicted by Jesus was really at hand, and nothing mattered except to avoid pleasure and joy. Nearly all these historians describe the Roman system of schools fully and with great admiration, and then they strain the evidence to cover the appalling gap which they find after the triumph of Christianity. Boyd, as we saw, fancies that some zeal for education lingered in Gaul. He is apparently following Denk's Gestalt des Gallo Frankenstein Unterricht, terrible German, which I have read. But he finds only one or two miserable little schools, and of these, as Denk says, Denk, D-E-N-K, as Denk says, the aim was always sacred. In fact, it happens that we know more about the state into which Gaul fell than we know about any other province of the old empire, as described by Gregory of Tours in his History of the Franks, itself one of the crudest books I have ever read. It was ghastly. Compare, in the end, sadly confesses the truth. Once the pagan schools were closed, Christianity did not open others, and after the 4th century, a profound night enveloped humanity. The labor of the Greeks and Romans was as though it had never been. In that verdict, every expert historian of education agrees. The most that any man can find after the year 450 is a small school here and there for the training of clerics. Seeing that priests had to read the Bible, the breviary, and the missal, we will hardly call that even the dullest glow of a zeal for education. My second point is as firmly demonstrated as the first. The Church took the view of Tertullian, that the pagan schools were inspired by demons and dangerous to the new faith. It laughed at their destruction, and it tried neither to reform nor replace them. In a sense, it destroyed the world's schools. And that is the end of chapter 4, and also the end of part 2 of Little Blue Book number 1128, titled The Church and the School, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1926. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 3.